Thank you so much for your presentation. That was fabulous. I was remiss in forgetting a couple of updates that I was asked to relay to you all before the panel began. First, if you are using social media, please tag us with using the hashtag AMIS 2022. And also, because these panels are being recorded, when you ask a question, please speak into the microphone, because otherwise you won't be able to hear it on the recording. All right. So our next paper is on the Apache Fiddle, and it's being presented by Curator Emeritus at the Metropolitan Museum, Ken Moore. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Meet Captain John Bork, commander of the White Mountain and Chiricahua Apache Scouts, who in 1886 captured Geronimo and his Chiricahua band. When I use the word band, I am talking about a group of people, not a musical ensemble. Bork's close association with the friendly Apache Scouts provided multiple opportunities to hear their music. In his diary entry on May 21st, 1883, he noted the use of the Apache Fiddle. Later, in 1891, he claimed that the fiddle was their favorite instrument. Bork's observations were the first written documentation of the instrument, and the fiddle he collected now at the Museum of the American Indian is the earliest known example. It looks unusual when compared to most of the models we see hanging on museum walls. Its single bridge, the missing nuts, and 3 strings seem atypical. But this bowed zither, made sometime between 1869 and 1886, is in fact one of several 19th century styles. Unfortunately, Bork's writings omit details concerning its use and context, only telling us its maker was a member of the Chiricahua band. This illustrates one of the challenges researchers encounter when struggling to construct a history of the instruments, identify the makers, production dates, and regional differences. The most frustrating issues concern provenance, as original source citations are mostly missing. Makers are listed in very broad terms like White Mountain or Chiricahua bands or Apache and Western Apache. A reservation like Fort Apache or San Carlos may be given as the attribution. These are inexact, as Apache refers to several loosely organized bands, and reservations accommodate more than one band within their borders. Dates are also imprecise, citing 19th century or a date range like 1886 to 1905. Object-related correspondence, potentially reliable documents, prove disappointing as they do not routinely specify exact instruments. One is unsure which instrument correlates to the object you have in hand. Native American sources, given the historical betrayals and inhumane treatment at the hands of the US government, are understandably reticent about sharing their insights with non-Indians. However, unexplored historical records, comparative data, and conflation techniques provide tools offering clues as to origins, chronologies, and the dynamics under which the fiddles were produced. Such previously ignored data may lead to a better informed interpretation of collections. To achieve this, an adequate sampling of instruments accompanied by competent information is necessary. This preliminary review draws upon the available data of 66 fiddles found in 17 collections, a selection too small to be complete, but large enough to begin formulating some parameters and questions for further study. Wherever Native American objects are exhibited, and Apache Fiddle is most likely displayed. The first thing we might question is the name. The people we call Apache call themselves Diné, meaning the people. The term Apache is probably derived from a Zuni word meaning enemy and was perpetuated by Spain's 16th century colonial government. The Diné, an Athabascan-speaking people, moved into the American Southwest from northern Canada about in the 15th century sometime. They had a close social, a loose social organization, living in 6 to 7 culturally related but separate bands. The fiddle appearing in the 19th century seems to have been primarily used by two bands, the White Mountains Band and the Chiricahua. They had at least 3 names for the instrument. Tsii wata Tsii, or nada benezosa, both translate as wood that sings. Another more humorous name, Tsii, meaning buzz buzz sound, is the other name. However, most non-Indians and museum catalogs call it an Apache fiddle or Apache violin. The origins of the fiddle are murky. Some claim it originated with the Apache. Others believe it was adapted from bowed instruments of neighboring Spanish-influenced people, like the Tsii or the Tarahumara, who occupied lands frequently raided by the Apaches. What we know is it appeared in the 19th century and was held against the chest to sound simple melodies adopted from pre-existing Toolby beer drinking songs. And according to Chesley Wilson, a 20th century maker, it played during courting and ceremony songs, social dance tunes, and used free improvisations. At times, several fiddle forms coexisted, changing according to the maker's creative impulses, the materials available, and perhaps in response to a non-Indian market. The typical fiddle uses a slightly conical, approximately 15.5-inch length of agave, split in half and hollowed, leaving the ends solid. The halves are rejoined with pitch and sinew or cord that's fitted into grooves at the end of the tube. The slit where the halves joined form a sound hole, although carved rounds and triangles or elaborate designs also occur. At the narrow end, a lateral tuning peg is added to tension a horsehair string that attaches to a tack or peg at the opposite end. 2 rectangular wood slips lift the string, which is sounded with a simple horsehair bow, often of ash or mesquite. Bows either form a C-shaped arch or a gently curved bracket, and some provide a hand grip. A clump of resin appears on a few of the instruments at the wider end. 3 additional peg configurations occur: upper and lower pins, often in conjunction with serrated edges at the tube's ends, lateral pegs at both ends, and another type introduced by AMIS Justina between 1890 and 1900, where the strings connect to 2 projecting dowels at the lower, larger end. This dowel connection eventually morphed into a single string holder developed recently by Anthony Belvado. 49% of the instruments surveyed were fitted with a single lateral peg, making it the most popular version. The fiddles are decorated with an array of geometric figures, painted, incised, or pyro engraved on the surface. These might represent the 4 directions: clouds, mountains, the sun, serpents, lightning, and wind spirits. But many have symbolic significance known only to the maker. Emblems occur as single shapes or are connected in series of rings encircling the instrument. Earlier instruments had less decoration, used graphite or crayon, and colors were limited. However, by 1887, with a market-driven demand and better access to pigments, colors other than black, red, white, and blue began to appear, adding yellows and greens and occasionally pinks and oranges. Two collections, the Metropolitan Museum and the MIM Brussels, have fiddles that are bored zithers instead of tubes. All are varnished wood, possibly black walnut, have gut strings, and use the same decorative program of incised geometric shapes with blue and green fill, outlined X's and snakes emerging from sound holes. The trapezoidal one has a slightly different program, but uses the same techniques as the others. It is constructed of 3 pieces instead of 2, and can accommodate a peg at the top for its 2 strings. The thin rectangular example from the Metz collection on the left was made by Geronimo's son, Chapo, while imprisoned at Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. We may assume that the 2 other instruments are his hand. Their form and materials probably reflect what was available in prison. Chapo was among the warriors who surrendered with Geronimo in 1886. He was 19 at the time. Geronimo's small breakout Chiricahua group had been fighting for 20 years after most bands were already subdued and relocated to reservations. When Geronimo's final hostile band eventually surrendered, he and approximately 512 men, women, and children were incarcerated, first at Fort Pickens in Florida, then at the Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and finally in 1914 moved to a reservation near Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Chapo, who had been at Mount Vernon Barracks, was among the children separated from their parents. Some were sent to Fort Marion in Florida, where Captain Richard Henry Pratt oversaw the early stages of a social engineering experiment to civilize and assimilate the Native American children into the Anglo-American culture. Pratt, who commanded African American soldiers and Native American Army scouts, believed they deserved the same opportunities as mainstream Americans. But he saw no value in coexisting diversity and famously adopted the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In 1879, he founded and supervised the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, an Indian boarding school. This infamous institution was a model for more than 300 boarding schools funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and often administrated by Christian missionaries. At these schools, children took on the trappings of mainstream America, trained in vocational skills, learned proper English and the mores of white society. Although the traditional Native Americans opposed these schools, progressive ones believed they offered a strategy to negotiate with non-Indians and encourage their children to attend. The school's goal, often reinforced by corporal punishment and forced attendance, was to obliterate Native culture. However, at least one income-producing item of Apache heritage was produced, though we may assume it was forbidden to those who made it. With the mandatory assimilation of Native children on and off the reservation, ethnologists and museums, trading posts, and collectors provided a market for objects of what they thought would be a vanishing culture. The Apache fiddle, like beautifully decorated beadwork bags, moccasins, and other apparel, pottery, rugs, and blankets were among the collectible items. Mary Elizabeth Brown, the founder of the Metz collection, contacted Pratt and received at least 10 of the 14 fiddles currently in the collection. Pratt writes in 1887 that the Met's first fiddle was provided by, quote, one of our Geronimo Apache boys. His name is Lawrence Goddeley, end quote. However, we don't know if Lawrence made it or obtained it from another source. He was only 12 when he entered the school in 1886. He trained as a farmer and was hired out for 4.5 years of the 6 he attended. He left the school in 1892 due to ill health, probably tuberculosis, and died a year later. Chapo, Geronimo's son, mentioned earlier, had a similar story. He arrived at the school in 1888. By this time, he was age 21. 3 years later, was hired out as a farm worker for 2 years and returned to the school in ill health, and in 1889 was discharged to die a month later. The school, be it a harsh environment, permitted family visitations, and Chapo, while visiting his father, was given a fiddle purportedly made by Geronimo, and in 1894 it made its way to the Met. By this time, Geronimo was a celebrity and no longer lived in captivity. Francis Dinsmore spotted him at the 1904 St. Louis exposition, where he was humming as he whittled arrows, which he sold along with his autograph. Geronimo's fiddle, although fairly plain, has a turned tuning peg showing some signs of acculturation and perhaps a concession to the times. By 1887, many instruments, especially those intended for trade, had taken on highly decorative elements. By 1920, makers had access to a full range of colorful paints, and AMIS Agustina took full advantage. His early work in 1890 was simple, but he soon developed his own recognizable style. His instruments, some slightly larger, have an energized use of 7 colors, forming multicolored bands of diamonds with zigzags, colored bullseyes, and teardrops. In addition, he introduced a peg that holds 2 strings to a dowel string holder at the opposite end. Later, he experimented with the form of the instrument, providing a swollen hip at the lower end. He was very prolific, and his beautiful instruments were extremely marketable and are now found in many collections. Chelsea Gosien Wilson, a descendant of AMIS Agustina, was more traditional in his approach. As an active medicine man, his goal was to perpetuate Apache crafts, customs, and ceremonies. In addition, he was a lecturer, a teacher, actor, and singer. For his work in revitalizing Apache traditions, he received a 1989 NEA National Heritage Fellowship. His fiddle, made in the same year for the National Museum of American History, is an exception to his more traditional designs. Today, following in Agustina's footsteps, is Anthony Belvado, a third-generation maker who learned the craft from his grandfather. He takes Agustina's string holder and the swollen form a little further, enlarging the instrument, adding a 3rd string, and now using nylon strings. As a working artist, Belvado's distinct approach features painted and sculpted 3-dimensional elements at the lower end, a prominent string holder, and frequently a hummingbird. He experiments with the form, pushing the tradition in hopes of perpetuating it. For almost 200 years, the Apache fiddle structure and decoration have reflected its maker's changing social and geographic environment. Enduring the perils of forced assimilation, relocation, and the perception by outsiders that the Apache culture was vanishing, the fiddle, like other objects, became a commodity. As a result, its cultural significance changed from entertainment and courtship to an object of spiritual reflection, heritage, identity, and continuity. There is more we don't know about this tradition than we do know. Perhaps a more comprehensive selection of instruments could reveal more of its history, answering a few outstanding questions. How many makers were there in the past? Were they all players as well? Why, with the exception of one, are they all made by men? Outside of the White Mountain and Chiricahua bands, who else made them, and could an analysis of decoration, pigment, and style identify specific hands? These are things that we can do for the future, and if you have some of the answers to these questions, let me know, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
Yes, on the instrument with 3 strings, there's only one tuning peg.
Exactly, and the instruments with 2 strings, there's only one tuning peg. They're knotted in the peg. And this is something that I want to look further into to see exactly how they tune those, because frankly, there is no information about these instruments. They're just a few articles and a few observations, like from diaries and different things. People write about them, but what they write is absolutely the same thing over and over again. So this is actually the most comprehensive, I think, document on them right now. So that it does need a lot of work. There are a little bit of problems working with Native Americans in that their approach to their culture is it's their culture, and so one will have. Well, for one thing, what I'd like to do, there are several. You see the collections that I have looked through. The Herd Museum is not there. The Field Museum is not there. So these are places that I need to go look. They don't have their collections online. You can't see them. And they don't have the information online either. Also, in Berlin, the Völkerkunde Museum, I believe, has some. I think I've seen some there. So there are a lot more instruments out there that need to be looked at. One of the things that I noticed on the instruments that I have seen is that there are some commonalities in the decoration on instruments, and these are all instruments that are anonymous. So this is something, again, to look further into and see if the museum records have anything other than the name of the location they came from. Anything else?
Yeah, I have a question over here, Ken. Have there been any efforts towards repatriation, either from tribes wanting to have these objects repatriated to them, or conversely, with museums trying to work with tribal communities to figure out a sense of, shared ownership or,
Yeah. Well, this is an ongoing process, but it began in 1995. And certainly, I worked on it for months, going through our records to find out where things were coming from and who to get in touch with and all of that. But this is an open-ended project. There are a lot of places that haven't done this, and private collectors haven't done it. The Met has just received a huge gift of Native American objects, and all of them have to be vetted. So, and the project is actually, with repatriation, the project is open-ended. Any tribal group can request an object at any given time. So there's no end date on anything. We've done our part and waiting. But the thing is, there aren't a lot of people that play these instruments either. Currently, they're just, and I think this is another thing. There's so many instruments out there, they had to have been made for sale because there weren't that many people playing them, as far as I can tell. Just maybe a handful of people. So even though work says this is their favorite instrument, you kind of wonder. It was certainly portable and something that they could, because the work that they were, it was 20 years they were chasing Geronimo, and this was his own people that were chasing him. I don't know if everybody knows that story, but it's a bigger story than what I'm telling. Yeah. That it? Oh.
Just real quick, what other instruments are contemporary in that culture to this fiddle?
To the study?
Well, no, to this particular instrument.
There are no other stringed instruments, but the other instruments would be drums, rattles, scrapers. Flute, definitely. And in fact, Bork, in one of his things, he talks about this instrument being played with the flute. And in fact, there is a recording called Wood That Sings that the Smithsonian put out years ago that this example comes from. Wilson, who was the one who was playing this, actually sings the song, plays the flute, and then plays the fiddle. So the flute probably was part of this. But I don't know that, nowhere does he say that it's played together, or if they were played linearly, or if anybody sang along with it. I have seen Belvato, the last maker I was talking about, when he demonstrates, and you can go online and find this, when he demonstrates the fiddle, he doesn't play a tune. He plays a rhythmic drone and sings to it. So, but nobody, in the things that you read about the instrument, nobody ever mentions that. But that's what he was doing in the film.
That probably gives the flutist a chance.
Yeah, maybe.
I have a practical question, I guess. You described in the different forms that many of the instruments had resin on the bottom. What's
Yes.
the resin for?
For the bow.
Oh, it's just for the bow.
Yes, it's for the bow, and it's been described as the secret.
Ooh.
It's how you get the instrument to sound. If you don't have the resin, then it doesn't sound.
Excellent, thank you.
So, yeah, Ken, thank you for this amazing paper. You talked about the three instruments that might have come from, I think it was Chapo Geronimo, and compared the one at MIM Brussels and the ones at the Met. From the documentation that survives, can you tell if Mrs. Brown was trading with these other?
Oh, she was trading.
This?
Yes. Okay. So here's another part of the problem of trying to figure out where things are coming from. She traded with the Smithsonian, and we actually, in our collection, we have accession numbers painted on some of our objects that are actually from the Smithsonian's numbers. And so she was in contact with Mason, and there were several people down there who would trade off. So of those instruments that came from Pratt, I keep wondering, did she trade some of those Pratt instruments? Are they all, so this is part of the problem of trying to figure out where things come from and how to handle that situation. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Oh, yeah. Stuart.
Well, just a couple of the instruments you showed had geometric designs that looked to me rather Navajo. And I wonder if that's just because of market factors.
Okay, so I mentioned that there were 6 to 7 bands. And what happened was the 7th band became the Navajo. And they became agricultural. And the others continued to follow the buffalo and to raid. They were raiders. They raided each other. I mean, they, as I said, it was a loosely knit society. But yes, there are Navajo designs. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? One more.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll make mine
Oh, one
super
more. Oh, one
quick.
more. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
I was wondering, some of the instrument makers that you've spoken with and interviewed, have they shared their take on this project or this research project of Provenance?
The instrument makers you've talked to.
The more contemporary ones, Belvado's very open about talking about things. Wilson was when he was alive. We don't know about AMIS, whether his instruments are so bright and colorful and energetic. To me, it's obvious he was making them for the market. And they are in a lot of different places, a lot of collections. But I think one of the people I'd like to talk to is Movado, because he does seem very open. He actually has another name for the instrument too, which I cannot even go near pronouncing it, which means bowed wood with horsehair. That's what it means. It's almost the same, but that has the horsehair in there.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ken.
All right. Thank you.